Let's do the same thing with a proof of stake network. Now, when we're attacking the proof of stake network, we actually have to purchase the majority of the stake. Let's be gracious here and say you actually just need to purchase 1/3, which is the case for some proof of stake systems. So let's say 33 billion. And let's say I'm also very conservative here and don't account for the price actually going up when you buy 50% of the supply. So let's say 33 billion. So that's what it looks like without slashing. Now, if we add slashing to that as well, and the attacker is clearly malicious, then what happens is when the first attack occurs, their holdings would actually get slashed. Then they would have to go back to the market and buy half of the supply again. Attack the network, get slashed again. Go back to the market, buy up the market, get slashed again. Ad infinitum.
So last week, I had Josh Ellithorpe give a nice spirited defense of proof of work as far as a consensus mechanism for crypto. And it's time to go for the proof of stake angle now. And I could think of no one better than Justin Bonds to do this. I don't know if you follow him on Twitter, Justin_Bonds, but he's kind of known for these crypto threads, these long Twitter threads about crypto, breaking down a lot of projects in detail. And he's kind of known to be more on the Ethereum side of things and a critic of Bitcoin and Bitcoin maximalism these days. And one thing I've noticed he's tweeted a lot about is proof of stake and defended Ethereum's implementation of it and other things like that. And also just opined publicly that proof of stake is the best way to go. And based on his critical and analytical style, I definitely thought he'd be one of the very best people to talk to about this, who'd make a whole lot of sense. And also someone who used to be a big proponent of Bitcoin Cash and so is very familiar with the good parts of proof of work as well. And is likely to find, I guess the strongest case you can get from someone who's still intelligent and has kind of thought things through from multiple angles. So anyway, I hope you guys enjoy. So, hey everyone, I have the fantastic pleasure today of speaking with the one and only Justin Bonds. How's it going?
It's going well. Thank you for inviting me on your podcast, and it's an honor being here. And I've followed you living on crypto for all these years now, and it's something I actually really admire, and it's a culture that's maybe a little bit lost in our modern cryptocurrency world.
Well, thank you. And yes, I do agree that it's a little bit of a minority culture at this point. And for those unfamiliar with Justin's work, he's known as the Twitter thread guy, amongst other things. So follow his threads on Twitter. There's a lot of good technical breakdowns of especially, Ethereum, Solana, those kinds of things. But also recently a lot of trashing of Bitcoin maximalists and stuff, which is one of my favorite hobbies. It's not my main job, but it's a hobby and it's one I enjoy very much. And throughout this entire thing, I've noticed that, so first off, I think Ethereum has sort of taken the center stage as far as cryptocurrencies are concerned, where Bitcoin was the pack leader for a while. Bitcoin still leads in market capitalization, but a lot of the narratives, a lot of obviously the network's fee revenue generated, a lot of development and all that is very Ethereum focused. And so when Ethereum switched from proof of work to proof of stake recently, that whole debate became kind of a front and center thing. And I heard a lot of very bad takes, but I also heard a lot of things that made me think on both sides. And a lot of us sort of accepted that because Bitcoin was first and it worked, the way it did it was the best way of doing things. So I've been trying to talk to everyone to try to see what are the best arguments for and against all these various systems. And so I've noticed you talked quite eloquently on proof of stake in the past. And so I figured it'd be a good time to kind of plow into that. So yeah.
Sure. No, I would love to. It'd be a very interesting discussion, and it's part of something I've been doing for a long time, having been a researcher in the cryptocurrency space since 2014, and then having founded Cyber Capital in 2016. Research has really been my main priority. Having started that early, obviously, I started off as a Bitcoiner.
Mm-hmm.
And I think over time, I really gradually turned away from Bitcoin and also eventually, until more recently, completely away from proof of work in general. Just because when I look at it from a really fundamental analysis perspective, I do think the pros very heavily outweigh the cons when it comes to proof of stake in terms of actually achieving, those very goals that Bitcoin was founded upon achieving.
Yeah, well, let's start out first. Do you mind giving a brief overview of proof of stake and why you think it's important? And then we'll kind of start diving into the more devil's advocate type questions.
Sure. I think the best way to think of proof of stake is really as you take proof of work and you just replace the primary incentive mechanism. So in many ways, in most ways, proof of stake and proof of work are similar. They're both achieving, decentralized consensus, and there's a lot of talk of different types of consensus algorithms from proof of stake, from DPoS, from pure proof of stake to reinventing the wheel 100 times. But I think fundamentally, when it really comes down to it, I really think we only have three options when it comes to decentralized. Well, actually, when it comes to networks in general, you have proof of authority, you have proof of work, and you have proof of stake. So I think those are really the three options. And the reason why I think proof of stake is better is because of it's so much more efficient. And that efficiency, I think, translates into it having superior economic and security qualities.
Yeah, and so, well, let's start out with proof of work. How long has proof of stake sort of existed as something like this? As in, was this an option for Satoshi Nakamoto back in the day starting Bitcoin, or was proof of work a conscious decision as far as starting the network that way?
It's hard to say, really. As far as I'm aware, there's no writing of Satoshi talking about proof of stake. So it could be that he just didn't come up with that idea, and we have proof of work, and then proof of stake was invented later. It could have easily have gone the other way around. I think that might have been quite an interesting alternative history, if you will, if proof of stake was invented first. I think proof of work would have a much harder argument to make, considering how expensive it is. And I think that's the thing that really I think is a thing to focus in on when it comes to proof of work, is that it's very expensive.
Yeah. So let's start with some of these security things, because this is honestly kind of not really my specialty as far as these various kind of technical things. And I know a lot of these things depend on implementation. But one thing I always heard in the older days of proof of stake was there's something about this nothing at stake problem. And I do remember a couple years ago, there were a few networks that were affected by this, where in a variety of ways, where basically in order to process blocks, in order to run the network, you have to prove you have a certain amount of stake of the coins. And some entities, some bad actors were able to spoof that by either moving the coins into an address, starting to stake, and then moving them out and selling them. But then the validators, I guess the network never caught on, and just other ways of basically finding a way to spoof having the stake. And I remember hearing arguments that proof of work can't be spoofed the same way because work itself can't be spoofed. And I thought that was an interesting argument, but I'm not smart enough to really be able to tell any merits of that. Do you mind talking about the nothing at stake problem, or if it's still even a problem?
No, absolutely. I never really thought that the nothing at stake problem really was a problem, and that it. I'm not familiar with this case of specifically spoofing balances. That might have happened with some very early proof of stake protocols, but that's definitely not a problem now. I mean, one of the reasons I think that is because we've had proof of stake blockchains operating and without slashing, and therefore so without nothing at stake being a major problem in those chains, because there is a cryptographic proof attached to that value that you hold in the token. Even though I don't say it's a major problem, I do think there's some niche cases where actually it could be an issue, and I think that's where slashing comes in. I just think we need to be extremely careful in how to utilize that, and that it's only really something that should be used in extreme cases, a bit like when you switch the mining algorithm in BTC. You'd only do that in a very extreme scenario. so to speak. So, for instance, if there was a very major disagreement over in a proof of stake protocol and the network split, and one group went this way and the other group went that way, and let's say one of those sides is highly malicious and is actually attacking the other side, well, they can attack the other side because they still have the majority of the stake on that other side. So it's in that scenario where actually slashing becomes an important mechanism. It doesn't even necessarily need to be built into the protocol for that to happen. But I think that's the one scenario in which I think you can validly say that is a nothing at stake problem, because the other side gets coins in both sides of the fork, which I think is how the nothing at stake problem was originally envisioned.
Yeah. Now, the one that's kind of hit my imagination the most is the bootstrapping problem, from what I hear. So, as far as I know, when you mine proof of work, the current state of the chain or whatever is determined by the most accumulated proof of work, and that's something you can kind of determine by, it's much easier to determine. I believe it was Amari Sachet was talking about that with stake, that in stake systems you need to, I guess, at least have some manner of trust in whoever the current nodes are in order to know the current state of the chain. That once you're there, it's fine. If you can stake on your own, but you have to, I guess, trust, like if it was run by just two nodes to begin with, the third node would have to trust the first two as far as their state of the chain, as far as if that's valid. Do you know
That's
anything about
just,
that?
but that would be the same in proof of work, wouldn't it? I mean, if there's only two nodes on a proof of work network and you connect to that network, then you have to trust those two nodes, right?
How the verification of that, this is why we're starting with the ones that are hard for me first and then kind of going in.
Sure.
But as far as I understood, you don't have to ask the miners to see what's the longest chain. You can, I guess, have an easier way of determining which is the longest chain without those miners being able to spoof you, I guess. That's kind of the difference from what I was led to understand, is the spoofing part of, if the work can't be spoofed, meaning you can just mine on the longest chain and you know what the longest chain is, whereas there could have been some sort of shenanigans in the beginning with bootstrapping a proof of stake node.
Yeah, I think a lot of these problems can be can be avoided. Like spoofing, balances is not really an issue, and I think you have a lot of problems. You have other problems on a blockchain if you only have two nodes as well. There's all sorts of problems that come with that.
Yeah.
So actually, if I may, maybe I can bring some stronger arguments for proof of work. Actually, playing devil's advocate a
Yeah.
little bit here.
Sure.
So one argument that I think, one advantage that proof of work I think definitely has, is how do you distribute a money, a currency fairly initially. And I think proof of work actually gives a better distribution, a fairer distribution, because proof of stake relies on people, holding the money. Well, how do you get that money to people, right? So in a lot of cases, you have a public sale, and you have, maybe airdrops, which is not a great solution, honestly. Which is why Ethereum's scenario is quite interesting, in that it actually went from proof of work and then to proof of stake, because that actually gives you somewhat the best of both worlds, because your initial distribution is far wider because of proof of work.
Yeah. So I guess we could just jump into that segment of things about coin distribution. The thing about coin distribution, is there a case to be made that proof of stake works the best when it starts as proof of work, then, for those reasons?
Yes, I actually think so. But I can give some more arguments for proof of work if you'd like, and then I'll give some of the arguments for proof of stake, because there's a few that I've identified that are definitely advantages that proof of work has. So another advantage of proof of work is that you have a greater cycling of participants in proof of work. So the people that are, say, mining, are say mining for, say, 3 to 5 years, and then it's a different group of people mining. Often it's miners tend to be very mercenary in their mentality. That's an advantage, but that's also actually a disadvantage, which I'd like to touch on later when we start talking about that.
Yeah. So it's an advantage in that it helps for, I guess, decentralization of who runs the network, but it's, I guess, a disadvantage in that it creates uh, people who are not necessarily as invested in the network's success and future.
Yeah, it's not necessarily the decentralization of the network. I think that's too simplistic of a take.
Mm-hmm.
It's the rate of the participants cycling, so that you have a different
Mm-hmm.
set of participants cycling at different time periods. That doesn't necessarily mean, in the grand scheme of things, that you have a wider set of participants, because I don't actually think that's the case. But I think just
Mm-hmm.
purely in that aspect, I think proof of work has a unique advantage.
Yeah. It's so when we're talking about the coin supply, do you believe there's a good case for starting proof of stake ever, and just starting pure and not doing proof of work first, and then kind of transitioning? And what are the best ways of distributing a coin supply in those cases?
Yeah, no, I actually think in most cases it makes sense to start off as proof of stake. It's just because if you launch a proof of work network, it's, as a new cryptocurrency, it's
Mm-hmm.
very likely going to be very insecure, because you don't have enough
Mm-hmm.
block reward to really pay the miners, and enough infrastructure and all these sort of things. And especially now that we have very sophisticated markets in terms of, renting hash power as well. Like,
Yeah.
small proof of work blockchains are actually very vulnerable to attack, unfortunately. Whereas in proof of stake, you have a set of holders, and those holders are not necessarily going to sell that easily. And some of that could actually be, early on at least, concentrated in the founders. Much like how Satoshi ran, big mining clusters at the very beginning. And that's not necessarily a bad thing if you really think about it more pragmatically. But there are
Mm-hmm.
unique cases where having a proof of work phase initially does give definite advantages to distribution. But I think it's a position of luxury, I think, to be in nowadays.
Yeah. It's so it seems like the coin supply, the distribution is a unique differentiator, or one of the big unique differentiators between the two systems, where a lot of, I guess, metrics and on chain analysis and stuff has been focused on, or with various projects, on how decentralized is the supply. Is it just I guess, a cartel in the hands of just a few people, or is it truly the people's money where everyone kind of has a little bit? It's very well distributed. It's so obviously proof of stake ends up, I guess, incentivizing a smaller group of people to hold more of the money. And if they do get entrenched over a period of time because they don't have costs like a miner, they can essentially hold on. It's not like when you hit a bear market, all of a sudden you have to turn off your mining machines, your revenue goes down, etc. There's that kind of accruing of funds and power in a certain group of people as a natural tendency. And do you think, obviously that's a trade-off, right? There's both. There's the security, as the greater, easier security, I guess, with proof of stake versus that. But don't you think that might lead to it becoming sort of more like the legacy financial system, in that a few of those big actors become entrenched and just don't get detrenched?
So I don't quite agree with this take. That proof of stake leads to a greater concentration of wealth, and thereby a greater concentration of who governs the system. I think if you take two, a proof of work system and a proof of stake systems, at similar scale, I actually would think the proof of stake system on average is going to be far more distributed. With distributed, I mean a distribution of power, right? Because it's not like, mining is particularly decentralized either. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
compared to something like proof of stake. So I think it's, there's reason to be concerned with both proof of stake and proof of work in terms of, centralization tendencies in these things. But the analogy that I like to use is a little bit like this, because if you see staking as a little bit like, at least in the future, I mean, today things are a bit different, but in the future, you would really see something like staking as a uh, low risk, low return investment. A bit like investing in a bond. or something along those lines. And that's not where wealth accumulation occurs in our society. I mean, if you take some of the very like successful, wealthy individuals, right, in cryptocurrency, like someone like Sam Bankman-Fried or CZ, from Binance, they started, companies, and in these cases, exchanges. But there's lots of other examples where I think greater wealth is actually accumulated from people that innovate, from people that actually build companies and are entrepreneurs, right? So if one party is like, oh, we're going to control the world by just buying Ethereum or buying the dominant proof of stake currency, we're just going to sit on it and we're going to become wealthier and wealthier. No, that I don't think that really makes sense, right? Because there's going to be greater wealth accumulation outside of that asset class, right? So I think that's a bit of a misnomer, the idea that proof of stake systems are just going to tend towards centralization. I think the opposite is true, especially if the network itself is growing, then it's going to tend towards decentralization, because as more people participate, more people are going to hold stake. And if more even large institutional parties get involved, then they're also competing with each other, right? And different geopolitical factions even competing with each other. And then this creates the, real, political decentralization that you'd want in such a system, so that it's truly, undefeatable.
Yeah, so that's like a more of a, I guess, realist take in kind of observing how the world economy works on just like the technical hair split kind of level. If someone acquires, let's just say, in early on, like 50% of the token and just decides to become a large staker, and even though it gets distributed, they basically become an entrenched. If they wanted to, right? Ignoring the economic incentives of, oh, I could put this wealth into building an exchange, take some risk or whatever, and maybe make way more money. But just for the sake of this, someone has a chunk and they're just lazy and they sit on it. They're kind of half the network forever. Whereas with the entrepreneurial kind of side of things plays into a mining farm, for example, where there are manufacturers that get entrenched because they build the most ASICs, and sure, there are some businesses that compete better, but there's still that constant threat of losing your power space, just like in the free market with a mining farm, whereas you could, if you wanted to, hold on to in a similar stake in a proof of stake network for basically ever.
Right, but what you said there is a key phrase that you said there. You said ignoring economic incentives,
Yeah.
right? So, and if what in reality actually happens every time is that these large holders become more and more diluted as they sell into the market, because they want to spend money on things and buy other companies, and parties that just sit on money and put it in these low risk type of things, they don't, and that's also not successful for that cryptocurrency itself. That cryptocurrency where 50% is held by a small party is actually not going to ever really succeed, right? Because it
Yeah.
doesn't have that distribution that's required. So yeah.
Well, to take it from a hostile actor kind of angle, where if you, and this is where it gets interesting because their economic incentives might be outside of the benefits of the network. But really quick before I forget that thought, because my brain is all over the place, are you aware of any research about the dilution of power of stake networks? So, for example, do you know of any good like studies or papers or something where it shows the whales diminishing over time? Because if so, I would love to link to that in the description at some point.
If I could think of something, I would love to quote it right now, but off the top of
Well,
my
sure.
head, I can't. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
But that's been my experience as well, observing
Yeah.
cryptocurrency distribution for all of these years. So
Yeah. After this, just send me any data you have, and I'll plug that in and mention it, because I love numbers and data, and if I think that's a great sign of that. That would be a great encouraging sign to point to, because a lot of networks have, like, people talk about whale problems, and data showing that isn't the case would be fantastic. But so take a hostile actor, right? You you can't bet on every crypto network, but you can bet on a few of the more positive ones, right? So you, let's just say you're a state actor. You say, oh, Ethereum's out there. I'm going to throw a few thousand to buy half the supply here. Like, just kidding. So there was an ICO, is not that case, but whatever. You spend small amount of money to buy significant stake in each of these major networks, and it's not that much money, and then it's no cost to just not spend, or it's very little cost to just not do anything with it. Wait and see if anyone become like winners, and then exert that control over the network for censorship or whatever reasons of profit outside of that network. Whereas it's hard to do that with proof of work. What you could do, obviously, is very low cost, mine a lot in the beginning, acquire a lot of the tokens, and then at some point in the future, if it becomes a threat, attempt to dump them or use something to exert price pressure. But you don't actually control the network. You don't get entrenched in the power structure of the network by mining at the beginning necessarily.
So it's an interesting idea that there's some nefarious party out there pumping up the whole cryptocurrency market by buying 50% of the supply of every coin.
Few other things make sense some days.
Part of me thinks that like halfway along that process, they're going to change their mind. They're going to say, hey, you know what? We're going to make more money going along with this. You know, there are those economic incentives again. But I think you brought up a very interesting point, which is from the perspective of attacking a blockchain network. And I've given this some thought, and I think we can run a bit of a scenario here that I always find enlightening. So let's say we take a proof of work network and a proof of stake network. Let's just make them hypothetical networks so that people don't get overly tribal about this one. But let's say they're both worth $100 billion dollars. Okay. If I use historical figures from 2020 for BTC, that would give us a value of about, and I'm being conservative here, so I'm being gracious with the numbers, but let's say there's about $2 billion worth of proof of work securing a $100 billion network. Okay, so let's say we wanted to attack as I say, a nefarious actor that's really just out to destroy and therefore has external incentives, let's say, from the blockchain economics itself. So let's say they want to attack the network. Now, they would have to buy or rent or take over or whatever it might be, at least $1 billion worth of hardware. If we want it to be really accurate, let's just say 1.5 billion or something, because you do need a bit of a margin over the 51%. So let's just, we're making the numbers more complicated, but that's fine. 1.5 billion to attack the network, right? Now, what happens then, right? Because then the attacker is able to censor transactions. It's also able to start double spending on exchanges, really disrupting things, right? So then the only real recourse that a proof of work network, and I mentioned this earlier, is you switch the mining algorithm around, right? The thing with that is that you can only do that once. So once you've switched the mining algorithm and you're either on GPUs or CPUs, if it's a very sophisticated and a very motivated attacker, let's say they already have 1.5 billion worth of CPUs and GPUs waiting, which are actually much easier to come by because this is general purpose hardware, right? So then the network comes under attack again. And at that point, there really is no recourse left, because at that point the network has been effectively defeated, right? I think all of these blockchain systems have physical limits at which they can be pushed, at which they can be broken, and we can actually try to discover where those limits are. So I would say with a $100 billion Bitcoin network, let's say it's going to be 3 billion, right? Now, let's do the same thing with a proof of stake network. This is where it becomes quite interesting, because now when we're attacking the proof of stake network, we actually have to purchase the majority of the stake, which is worth more than 2 billion, which would be worth 50 billion at least, right? And let's be gracious here and say you actually just need to purchase 1/3, which is the case for some proof of stake systems. So let's say 33 billion. And let's say I'm also very conservative here and don't account for the price actually going up when you buy 50% of the supply. So that's also a very important dynamic to keep in mind. And some people have very high price targets in their mind before they're willing to sell, and that can also affect, the market, dynamics significantly of the effort that's required to purchase that much of $100 billion proof of stake network. So let's say 33 billion. Okay, so that's what it looks like without slashing. Now, if we add slashing to that as well, and the attacker is clearly malicious, then what happens is when the first attack occurs for 33 billion, then their holdings would actually get slashed. So then they would have to go back to the market and buy half of the supply again, attack the network, get slashed again, go back to the market, buy up the market, get slashed again, ad infinitum, or for an infinity, so to speak. So this actually makes proof of stake, its breaking point is not there, so to speak, in such a direct attack. I mean, this would be incredibly disruptive, of course, and
Of course.
I am on the extremely cautious side when it comes to social slashing. Also being very, very skeptical of ideas of social consensus and UASF and all these sort of things. I'm actually a big believer in on-chain governance, and
Yeah.
I think, but I think there is that worst case scenario, I think, in which that card can be played, and
Yeah. This
but
might be a good
yeah.
time to go into slashing, because I think that slashing is a very misunderstood or understudied kind of function. So first, for the sake of slashing, what events trigger a slash?
So it really depends at what we're talking about here. And just follow up on what I was saying before. We're
Yeah.
looking at a tenfold increase in the cost of attack, right?
Yeah, of
3
course.
billion against 33 billion. So I just want to point that out when I say that, proof of stake has some real advantages when it comes to security. Now back to slashing. I think there's really predominantly two forms of slashing, if you will. There is slashing in terms of the protocol design, so and the consensus algorithm, and that's very like automated. That's like part of the algorithm, right? So that's
Yeah.
like, for instance, if your validator node goes offline, then you get slashed. You get punished for a lack of liveness, right? Or let's say you do a double spend, and well, you approve a double spend, and like the majority says, oh, whoa, that's not okay. Then you also get slashed, right? So there's some examples of where slashing is providing this extra incentive for the network, or a stick in this case, in the carrot and stick analogy. So then there's the other type of slashing, which is the slashing that I think we need to be very careful of, which is this idea of social slashing, which is highly subjective. Because the problem with it is that in the first form of slashing, you have a majority, or you have very clear logical rules saying this is not okay, right? But in the second form of slashing, it's only really something that makes sense if a majority has already succeeded in taking over the network. That's why it's really that nuclear option, the equivalent of a proof of work mining algorithm switch, which is incredibly destructive, because it means that all of your honest participants in a yeah, actually that's a good point. I just realized this now as I'm discussing it. There's actually one advantage over slashing versus a mining algorithm switch. In a mining algorithm switch, you're actually also punishing all of your honest participants, all of your honest miners that are protecting the network but have been overpowered by a malicious actor. They're all being punished. They're all losing their investments. A lot of them are probably going bankrupt, and they did nothing wrong, right? At least with a social slash based on social consensus, at least the honest actors are still protected in that way. Though obviously the other side could slash them on their chain. But I think this is where it just becomes the equivalent of Bitcoin, where it's actually just a split scenario, right? Except for you don't get coins on each chain, I suppose, if you're a validator. If you're not a validator, then you do get coins on both chains, which I think is a fair enough arrangement as far as I can see.
Yeah. And so the risks of a majority actor coming in and I guess slashing the competition is not that bad of a risk, considering that they get slashed back and it's on separate chains and it just ends up as like a chain split. Is that kind of the overview?
Yeah, yeah, a chain split, indeed, and potentially even making the network more valuable in the process. All that fighting over the stake has got to do something for the price too, which is
Yeah.
an ironic result of an attack, considering how much price drives, unfortunately, a lot of people's support for cryptocurrency.
Yeah, it's definitely definitely a lot of capital controls a lot of that kind of stuff. One thing I noticed when people are talking about different, this came up a lot during the great the block size debates and all that, where there's an attempt to find consensus, community consensus around certain issues, and what became apparent in those cases was that there are multiple, I guess, power centers or actors in a proof of work system. Obviously, the miners were considered to be the final word, the first and final word, the ones who secure the network, the ones who decide about governance, etc. Then we had the whole UASF thing and a bunch of basically, from my opinion slash recollection, it seemed to be that the larger block size camp had much more miner support. However, the miners ended up then largely going with the safer option of the one megabyte based on users and other things like that. Or I'm varying. There's there's like a minefield of trigger words in that, depending on where anyone was on the block size kind of thing. But basically, you have miners, and then you also have holders, at least, where you have holders who drive the price of the coin. They dump on it, they buy it more, whatever. There's a lot of power in that. But then there's the miners who do their own thing. Whereas with a proof of stake network, those two camps are kind of the same, as in the holder is the miner at the same time. So rather than balancing out different power structures where you have to kind of keep both happy, they both contribute to it, now you kind of have just more like a monolithic group of like one group of people that does everything. The holders decide everything, kind of. And
Okay.
so do you think that that's a challenge or a disadvantage?
I'm really happy that you brought this up. I think we're both veterans of the block size debate, which was a very fascinating time. But it's one of the reasons I'm so skeptical of proof of work now. Is I think that as a governance mechanism, I think proof of work failed there. And that's because I think that, at least what I wrote about this subject, is that I think the miners should have taken a more dominant role in the decision making, and I think they failed to do that. And I think furthermore, I think there's a specific reason for that. And I would also like to touch on the balance of power between different parties as well. But I'll discuss this issue with the miners first. And actually, this is what I was alluding to earlier as well, in regards to some of the pros and cons of mining, that cycling that I was talking about earlier. Is I actually think that miners have a distinct lack of a sufficient long-term incentive. So what I think happened in the block size debates is that a lot of these miners, well, the vast majority of them actually, have, say, a 3 to 5 year horizon. They get in and they get out.
The
So now
5-year
in their
plan.
exactly. Oh my, that's yeah.
Dubious.
Yeah. So basically, what happened for a lot of miners is they had a choice. Like, okay, we can prioritize short term, midterm, or we can prioritize for what's best for the network over the long term. They prioritized what it was good for the network on the short to the midterm, at least from their perspective, which was not to rock the boat. Okay, and that, I think, is a major downfall, I think, of proof of work as a governance mechanism, is that I think miners lack sufficient long-term incentives. And I think through proof of stake, and especially through having very long lock-in periods, not as long as Ethereum's currently. I think that is a
Yeah.
bit too long, which is no limit as of now. But I think that helps to ensure that this important actor in the governance of a blockchain is going to do what's in the blockchain's best long-term interests. And I think that's something that really failed to occur. And I actually wrote a theory on Bitcoin governance, and it was largely based on my experience from the block size debates. And in it, I actually said that there's actually 3 stages of governance. That the first stage of governance is actually the implementations or the clients, right? So these are developers creating code, because we need code to vote on in the first place in any
Of
governance
course.
process. And I think where Bitcoin really went wrong is that the block size debates wasn't, I mean, the block size is definitely very important, but it wasn't primarily about the block size. It was really more about governance. It was more about who decides, how do we make decision, who controls this. And I think in that regard, Bitcoin Core, which is the dominant client implementation in Bitcoin, really gained a disproportionate power, and it ended up pushing out a lot of the other clients implementations in the process. And then if you think of at least an idealized version of Bitcoin governance, would be something along the lines of first you have the implementations, they create code, right, that people can choose from. Then you have the miners, who then decide what code to run, right? But if the miners don't have, or can only choose from one party, it's effectively a one-party system now. Going back to your earlier comparison, um, it's basically a one-party system. So you say, okay, miners can choose what code to run, but there's only really one code that you're allowed to run or is seen as being socially acceptable to run, because otherwise you are an enemy of Bitcoin for the most part. And the few other clients that exist over Bitcoin are basically kowtowing to Bitcoin Core now. And that to me is really a fundamental failure in my model of governance. At least the 3-stage model is it was implementations, miners, and then market. Because if say it's still contentious, a split occurs, and then the market decides which side to support. So the market actually ends up being the ultimate arbitrary of truth. And the role of the miners is really to attempt to predict what the market wants. And I think that role, I think, was really underplayed. Now, what we're doing with proof of stake is you take that same 3-stage model of governance, right, with the same checks and balances, if you will, and we're just replacing miners with stakeholders, right? But the stakeholders didn't really have a say in the previous system. And I think instead of creating this other class, this minor ruling class, effectively, the stakeholders all get to vote over the future of the chain and fulfill that role, which also goes back to what I was saying before about proof of stake and proof of work actually being far more similar than a lot of people realize.
Yeah, and especially when you're talking about that, the market is the final decider. That sort of reminds me of 2 very different, but at the same time, sort of similar cases of you have the Steam and the Hive split, where basically through delegated proof of stake, Steam was taken over essentially, and there was a fork, Hive, which the market almost unanimously, I would say 90% plus, just went straight there. As far as the users went there, as far as the applications, everything went there. And then Steam kind of, maybe I don't want to speak out of turn because I have not looked into what Steam's up to these days, but it effectively could have become a ghost chain. And in a much less dramatic and much more nuanced way, you could talk about the Bitcoin split in a similar way, where you had Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash splitting off. And this is very different because people do use Bitcoin Cash still to this day in a lot of ways that they don't maybe use Bitcoin. But in the terms of the economics of things, it seems like the market went with the core implementation up to this point. That could change, but the market seems to have kind of gone there and not as much in the other direction.
So I'm actually going to disagree with you on that last point. And this is another way to
Yes.
look at it.
And
And you know,
and a disclaimer, I only presented that point to try to do an allegory for the Steam Hive situation in proof of work. If there's a better
enough.
example, I'd be more than happy to use that, but it was a poor example on purpose.
no, I
Yes,
understand.
but go ahead still.
That's fair enough. Yeah. I actually think that because, you know, as a result of the block size debates, you know, Bitcoin refused to scale, and you know, its culture got very toxic, and mass censorship, and all these things. And you know, I also was, you know, an early supporter of Bitcoin Cash, and I was, you know, there since day one, really. And you know, I came to realize that, you know, the market did route around BTC. It just didn't route around BTC through BCH necessarily. It routed around BTC through Ethereum, right, and through you know, other blockchains, and also partially BCH. I mean, it still has, you know, a respectable number of transactions occurring over it. Last I checked, but I think that's the kind of more zoomed out view of what's happened here. And if we look at like a lot of, you know, the really dominant blockchains today, like Cardano and Ethereum and Avalanche. These are all examples of blockchains. Actually, I'm not sure about Cardano, actually. I'm going to take that back. I want to be accurate with what I'm saying here. But at least with Avalanche and Ethereum,
So
and there's
you've been on
many
Twitter,
more
I
examples
see.
of this.
You don't want to speak ill of Cardano, lest the swarm descend upon you.
I will release another critique on Cardano one of these days. Well, I'm feeling brave, but I have to admit their community is pretty rough. No, I just wasn't I wasn't 100% sure if that was the case, but at least with Vitalik and Imogen Sire and Dan Larimer at least as well, I think, you know, there's very clear examples of what you can look at is why they created the blockchains they did. You know, Ethereum, you know, very much was created in response to, you know, the whole op return, you know, issues in BTC, where even before the block size debates, you know, well, I think they were just starting to heat up. But this is, you know, Bitcoin Core started restricting the op return field, which is something that Counterparty was using at the time, and that was Counterparty was creating these like, you know, basically the equivalent of ERC20 tokens over Bitcoin.
In fact,
You know,
back in the day, I did use Counterparty. I believe it was for some things like, I believe Scott Coin was some like Scotland regional crypto that I was using on Counterparty. I didn't really understand how it worked or how the gas worked for Bitcoin. But yes, I do remember Counterparty. People use it today.
interesting. Yes. I think Rare Pepis or something along those lines pretty big on there today.
Yeah.
But basically that was restricted, and that made it a lot less capable. And I think that also affected OmniLayer as well. So really that was really very early examples of Bitcoin Core really restricting the utility and the usability of Bitcoin. And obviously, you know, restricting the block size limit to 1 megabyte really was the, you know, final nails in the coffin there. But I think that also really very directly inspired and drove a lot of the brightest minds to just go build another alternative to BTC. You know, and I think that's where a lot of the market went. I'd like to touch on just the Steam Hive situation. If I remember correctly, it was Justin Sun. Now, I hope I'm getting this right, but I believe it was Justin Sun, wasn't it? Yes. He actually ended up in a private equity deal buying the foundation, which held a lot of the coins, and was thereby able to gain a majority over the network. It's a very, very unique and peculiar situation.
Yes, it wasn't like an intentional hostile takeover from I guess a network perspective where it's like, I'm gonna go do this. It's just kind of like by happy accident ended up with something due to a weird way, the way the Steemit Foundation was created.
That's right, and those coins were not intended to be sold off to some crypto billionaire and who could do then whatever he wanted with it. That was actually that those coins were actually really much intended for the community. So it was quite the betrayal.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so let me touch on the exchange kind of problem.
Sure.
I don't use centralized exchanges. Most people, even who do, say don't keep your coins on exchanges, etc. They are, however, very important economic actors in the crypto markets, possibly the most significant, depending on I guess your perspective. But they're also one of the more vulnerable to, I guess, regulatory capture or state influence. Now, with going back to the split of like the miner incentive pool versus the holder incentive pool, it's already a problem with, say, something like Bitcoin, that so much of it is on exchanges, and exchanges can be targeted by a state actor to start implementing KYC on everyone, or as we've seen with like the travel rule, for example, or just, confiscating money, or any number of awful things. Now, the challenge, of course, with proof of stake is a lot of that also gives you sort of keys to the kingdom as far as the ease of attacking a network, perhaps, or at least controlling it, where it might not be that a government has to, or a hostile actor like that has to actually go out on an open market and buy up coins in order to either control part of the network or attack it directly, that they can just go to exchanges and say, do our bidding, and exchanges have an inordinate amount of now control over the network. It's like a one centralized thing, whereas, or centralized, sorry to use these trigger words, but it kind of a single target. Whereas if a state actor wanted to go after something like Bitcoin, they would probably go after the exchanges, and then they would go after mining pools or mining farms or whatever. There's at least two separate actors that they have to go to, rather than just sending Coinbase a letter or something like that. So do you think that that's a worrying possible vulnerability in proof of stake systems that maybe proof of work is not as strongly affected by?
Yeah, I would agree, actually. I would say that's probably one of the biggest challenges that proof of stake faces, is the tendency for a lot of people to keep their coins with an exchange. But I do think this will be more alleviated over time. I really do believe that, just because of the nature of power and the nature of competition, is that this becomes more and more distributed, wider and wider. I mean, Bitcoin itself definitely also had some early growing pains as it was still scaling, and we had some scares in Bitcoin as well, where individual miners were approaching 50%, or at least pools which were largely controlled by individual parties were growing up to 50%. In some cases in which they just created another pool which was effectively controlled by the same party, and everyone's like, "Whew, the pie chart looks good again now." Like,
Yeah.
but I think Ethereum is a little bit unique, is because it has these lock-ins right now, which I think are excessive. But I think that I think that once those are lifted, then I think there will also be a tendency towards that becoming more spread out. And it's also important to keep in mind that out of the top 3 holders right now, one of those is actually Lido, and Lido is what you could call a quote unquote decentralized pool, which is something that's really failed to really take off in Bitcoin, for numerous different reasons. So there's actually quite a bit of hope that actually the prominence of Lido, and I'd like to also call out Rocket Pool, which is also very very capable of providing people with this service of actually bringing together people to stake and have this kind of large pool through a smart contract, right? So it's actually the security of the chain is actually protected by the security of the chain, if you will.
Yeah, it's interesting enough. Yeah, so on that subject of lockup periods, I guess it could be analogous a little bit to proof of work mining equipment, because you do have to lock up funds, and the only thing is you can't really get them out as easily at the end of that. But what do you think of lockup periods in general? I mean, first off, do all proof of stake networks have lockup periods? And what do you think of? Do you think they're necessary? Do you think they're good? Do you think things could be done better without them? What do you think of lockup periods?
Right. So Ethereum, in Ethereum's case, it's not really a lockup period. It's like a weird, well, you can't withdraw it yet until we're finished creating this code, which is not really what I usually talk about when I say lockup periods. So I actually think that because of the problem that I mentioned earlier, Like, because, there is reason to think that the same problem we saw with long-term incentives is we'll see that in proof of stake as well, considering how similar these systems really are. So maybe that its stakeholders now instead of miners is by itself not enough to guarantee those long-term incentives. So I'm actually a big advocate for having very long lockup periods, actually, but having them weighted. So people that want to lock up for longer actually get more weight in the voting process. And I'd like to add on top of that as well, I think on-chain governance is absolutely critical, that we have a clear process in place where we can say, here's a proposal, here people can vote for the proposal, and this is what we're going to implement. I think without this type of mechanism, I think it's just flirting with disaster and really, major splits and major disagreements and power struggles, or potentially getting captured, actually is inevitable in my view. And unfortunately, actually, Ethereum is not pursuing on-chain governance right now. So that's something that I really would like Ethereum to see change, and where I think some of its competitors really have a leg up against it.
Yeah, for sure. Now, we'll just sort of almost wrap up with the OFAC question, which, and as a disclaimer, I did see both a thread that you did on it and then a thread that someone else did on it, that, and I guess my concerns or whatever are put to bed, but I'm not assuming the audience will have the same. So basically, there's a majority, I guess, of Ethereum blocks right now which do not process Tornado Cash transactions or other things that are basically censored by the U.S. government. And essentially that means that those transactions have to be processed by the minority of the block producers, and maybe it'll take longer to do. Like right now it's a little bit of an inconvenience, but over time it could be that a worrying trend that all of Ethereum becomes censored, or at least enough of it becomes censored so it's very difficult to do non-compliant transaction stuff on the network. So what's your take on that whole situation?
I'm glad you brought this one up. It's been a very interesting topic to look into. I think, as is typical in the cryptocurrency space, I think it's a bit overblown for some people, at least, that are saying that it's really being censored. I think one of the first things to really keep in mind is that there is no real fundamental difference between proof of work and proof of stake here. They actually both suffer from the same problem, which is that miners / validators or stakers, they basically get to choose what to put into their blocks. So if they're under or in a jurisdiction that says, hey, you can't include, this sanctioned list of transactions, right? That is, at least theoretically and fundamentally, it's the same problem with proof of stake and proof of work. Now, I would even go so far to argue, and I'm going to get to why this is a more acute problem in Ethereum right now, which is the specific reasons for that. But I'm going to speak to the more general scenario first. I would even go so far to argue that actually Ethereum, that proof of work, is actually more vulnerable to this type of censorship. The reason for that is because proof of work has a massive physical footprint and has massive electricity consumption. I mean, you can see these mining farms from space. So, this idea, therefore, is that, this is easier to regulate and to control. If it's sitting in, a lot of mining power is sitting in the United States right now. So that's the idea, because, having these massive mining farms, and then you compare that to proof of stake, where you can literally run a validator from a Raspberry Pi anywhere in the world, right? I mean, it's ironically a little bit of the BTC's Maxi's vision of BTC, even though that's not really how Bitcoin is run, but that's how some people think it is.
You can't mine from your Raspberry Pi.
No, absolutely not. And I'll take this opportunity to say I don't think non-mining nodes really have much of a say at all in a network, and don't really do much to contribute to a blockchain network at all. I think it's good that people are able to run them generally, but I don't think they really should have any sort of weight in decision making, because obviously they are not at all Sybil resistant. But to go back to the OFAC problems and the issues with censorship. So I would say that proof of work generally is therefore easier to censor because it's just so physical and it's so large and it has such a large footprint and electricity consumption, et cetera, right? And because it relies on that instead, proof of stake is a digital construct, so that can easily be moved, so to speak. Now, why is this a bigger problem over Ethereum now than it is Bitcoin? I will say, there are OFAC-compliant blocks over Bitcoin. There's just not a lot of noise is being made about it, and I suspect, I haven't actually done the research myself, but I suspect some pools are just quietly being compliant without making noise about it, because
Yeah,
there's
of
not
course.
many transactions you wouldn't have to include, and it would kind of go under the radar, right? Um, so the idea is, and this is how Bitcoin, this is how blockchains have always worked, right? There's always been this issue, but the thing you have to realize is that if you're a validator and you're not including certain transactions, right, that doesn't mean that those transactions are being censored. It just means they take a little bit longer to get confirmed, right? Because all it takes is one miner or one validator to include a transaction, and you've effectively circumvented censorship. And this has always been part of the fundamental design of how Bitcoin censorship resistance is supposed to work. Is it's not the case that it takes 51%. No, it takes 100%, or let's maybe say 99.9% accounting for variance, to actually censor the chain. So if only a very small minority of validators, includes it in their blocks, then censorship has been effectively diverted. And, to those Bitcoiners who might say, well, it's a form of censorship because now it takes longer to confirm. Okay, well, in Ethereum, block times are around 13 seconds. And if 50% of blocks are OFAC compliant, then now your confirmation time will be 30 seconds instead. Comparing that to, Bitcoin's 10 minutes, it seems a bit of a funny criticism, to lean into that particular side of things. Now the reason why, this has been such an issue in Ethereum is a peculiar development, really, if you think about it. But it's because of MEV, which stands for miner extracted value. And basically this is a consequence of DeFi over Ethereum, is that because of the nature of a transparent blockchain, you're actually, miners or validators are able to actually front run certain trades, or determine the transaction ordering of certain blocks can actually be very beneficial, and there's a value in that people are willing to pay for. So there is this centralized entity known as flashbots, which became extremely good at extracting MEV. They became very good at providing extra value. So what a lot of validators started doing is they use flashbots as a relayer, a lot like actually some of the compression networks that exist for Bitcoin miners. Bitcoin miners like Falcon Network, for instance. Bitcoin miners actually have their own centralized relay networks, actually, that they communicate through with each other very fastly. I think Matt Carabo controls Falcon Network. I'm not 100. I should be careful what I say here, but I believe that's the case. So Flashbots is somewhat equivalent to that, except for, and the reason why this is not happening over BTC is because there is no MEV. There is no significant value being traded in DeFi in BTC. Therefore, it's not worth exploiting, which I find somewhat ironic in that sense.
Yeah, of course.
But because this relay of Flashbots is in the United States, all of the blocks that it's been selling or passing on to block producers, so to speak, are compliant. So that's led to a very large proportion, at least relative to something like Bitcoin actually being OFAC compliant. Now, what's interesting here is in the past, I'll create an analogy here. In the very early history of Bitcoin, right, nodes and miners were the same thing. Then as the network evolved, they organically separated, and now they're two separate things. A miner is not the same as a full node. Most miners don't even run full nodes. The pools do. They run the full nodes for miners, right? So it is where a case where organically things have split up. Now, what we can see in Ethereum is that because of MEV, it's organically split, where now you have relayers and you have the validators are now two separate parties. Now, in order to resolve this, there is PBS, which stands for Proposer Builder Separation. Yes, I got it right. And with PBS, what they're doing is they're actually baking that into the protocol in such a way that now that separation is recognized natively within the design, and that the people that are creating the blocks or buying the blocks, let's say from the relayers, don't actually know what's inside of them. And therefore, this completely solves this problem by separating it out and creating a degree of anonymity so that they can't be held, accountable for what they're putting into their blocks. So the irony of this situation is Ethereum is getting all of this criticism from Bitcoiners who actually Bitcoin has the same problem, but it's only not being exploited because there's not enough value to be exploited, right? While Ethereum is actually creating a solution. And Bitcoin actually remains complacent, still having this problem. And this problem applies to all blockchains. We're only really seeing it with Ethereum now because, because of a lot of that value that exists there today. And I'd also like to add that Flashbots made an announcement at Bogota just a few days ago, actually, maybe a week ago now, that actually they'll be decentralizing their relayers as well. So we'll see what comes first. So this problem is going to be very much resolved. I will also add what real censorship looks like and this is true for both proof of work and proof of stake. What real censorship looks like is you would actually have to start not building upon previous blocks. And that would actually create a split in the network. So the real disincentive is actually against censorship is splitting the network. So parties such as Coinbase and Lido wouldn't do this, obviously, but Binance maybe, these sort of parties, or FTX, these are the kind of parties we're worried about, right, that hold a lot of stake and are centralized. They would actually have to coordinate and actively split the chain in order to create censorship. And then they would get all of their clients or all of their customers, Ethereum in this case, slashed. Right? There's a very large legal liability attached to that. So yes, I'm not happy with the current concentration of stake in exchanges. I think anyone that is sincere about this shouldn't be happy about that. But there's very good reasons why we can see that, one, becoming more distributed, and two, also, those incentives just strengthen over time.
Yeah, and obviously this isn't a proof of work versus stake kind of point, but do you worry that this kind of softer censorship type thing might start to take hold more, where it just the economic incentives are for actors to just not include sanctioned transactions or certain use cases? Like, let's just say, for example, let's just take Tornado Cash as an allegory for just any kind of privacy on Ethereum. And just privacy is banned in the Western world. So there's, like, let's say 10% of validators that still will process that. And that means you can still use it. It does still go through, but it's starting to become, slower and more expensive and stuff like that. And then it's, even though you're not banned from doing these kinds of things, it becomes undesirable. And so the average, it's not the criminals will still do criminal things, but the average user just seeking more privacy will start to just move away from that, and has kind of a chilling effect.
No, I mean, there definitely is a chilling effect. I mean, that's something that governments are doing. I do think privacy, should be a right. I think as a lot of these institutions themselves get more involved in public networks, they'll start to see more of a need where they need privacy as well. And I think that's also the flip side of it. Encryption over the internet, can't really make that illegal. So many businesses couldn't even function, properly. So I think that's somewhat the other side of that incentive. Yeah, but I mean, look, if there's also an advantage to this, right? Because this, I've always been a big believer in the ideal blockchain. To me, has optional privacy. I know some of the Monero folks might be screaming at this podcast right now,
Yeah, you got the
but
Cardano people, now the Monero people. I'm sure the
I,
Maxis.
I'm in a bad habit of
Yeah.
upsetting some communities, I suppose. But the reason why I think that is because transparency is very desirable for some organizations. We want some of our institutions to be highly transparent, and we want individuals to also have privacy, or intelligent agencies, for example, will want privacy. So I think that's really the ideal arrangement. And I think demonizing you must be a criminal because you want to be private is just a ridiculous proposition, and we really need to turn that around as a culture. So yeah, no, I think that's an issue. I think that if your transactions are still getting through, I mean 10%, it means you're still getting confirmed within a minute. And if the network is not congested, I think, as I think especially as the space matures, unconfirmed transactions should also just be accepted in a well-scaled network as well. So I don't think that's really a major issue there. But yeah, I'm absolutely concerned with like a lot of the censorship issues, around that, and governments really going around banning things. But again, it's not an issue that's unique to proof of stake or proof of work in that regard. Since also, since we're talking about proof of stake, I also didn't mention that proof of stake has some major economic advantages too, because I'm a believer in sound money, right? Some of these Austrian ideas, even a lot of the ideas of Bitcoin, so to speak, is that ultimately, because proof of stake is more efficient, you get more security for less, so to speak. You can create cryptocurrencies that are either more scarce, or have lower fees, or a combination of both. And I think that actually gives it better economic qualities. So it has better economic qualities, it has better security qualities in my eyes as well. And I suspect, and I think it's important to keep in mind that these are all still, social experiments, right? Much like how the United States is still a ongoing social experiment. These social experiments are things we, need to play out in the real world. And I think as empiricists, we need to sit back and participate, but also, be open and see, what does the experiment give us? Like, what do we learn from this experiment? And understand that these things still take more time to play out. And in that regard, there's a lot of reasons to be confident in cryptocurrency.
Yeah, so I'd like to sort of end on probably the least interesting part of this whole thing to me, but I kind of have to include it, which is the energy discussion. Now, obviously, Ethereum's, or proof of stake, I should say, is more efficient in that it doesn't have to do extra energy expenditure in order to do security. There's no like power consumption that's associated with just the security part. Now, that being said, is the energy, the ecological disaster kind of narrative overblown in proof of work? I'm not saying specifically for Bitcoin, because Bitcoin doesn't do a lot of economic activity for the amount of energy it burns. But for example, at scale, if you have miners processing millions and millions of transactions a day, and versus validators, which also have to expend energy to run their own machines to make sure block propagation times are good, et cetera, that even though it's clearly more expenditure on the proof of work side, it's not significantly more enough to where it really matters at truly large scales.
Yeah, I mean, Bitcoin's a terrible, BTC is a terrible example of that right now because of the low capacity. It's just what, $100 per transaction or somewhere along those lines, if you actually calculate the real cost that's being subsidized through inflation. But I mean, the intent of the Bitcoin network was always, if you increase the number of transactions, the amount of mining required is not increased alongside that. So, I mean, look, if proof of stake didn't exist, and I didn't think it was a superior solution, then I wouldn't think proof of work is inherently wasteful. Because it's actually at scale. It's arguably more efficient than things like Visa and Mastercard. That have to have these big skyscrapers and
Of course.
tens of thousands of compliance officers, and so in that regard, I think it's actually more efficient if you actually allow proof of work networks to scale. But you're still consuming more energy than decently large medium-sized countries. Like that's absolutely insane. The amount of energy
Yeah.
that's being consumed, the amount of hardware, like just the cost for all of that hardware, and all of that waste, and all of those rare earth minerals, and like it's absolutely phenomenal. And energy is just so important for our economies and for our prosperity, that to me it seems, if proof of stake is a better solution in every really conceivable way, in my view, then proof of work becomes extremely wasteful in comparison. In a world before proof of stake, I wouldn't have said that, but because we have this alternative that is so much more efficient, why use a technology that is so much worse?
Yeah.
And that really is how I see it today. And that really can't be justified. I mean, I care, if I'm being honest, I care more about the economic effect that means, because all of that cost, all of that expense, it needs to go somewhere. And that makes proof of work comparatively less sound as a form of money, just because it's so much more expensive. It requires higher inflation or fees to maintain compared to a similar proof of stake system.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. This has been quite the enlightening chat. I've enjoyed it thoroughly. Where could people find more about you and your work and follow you?
You can follow me on Twitter on Justin_Bonds. And you can also check out my company, Cyber Capital, where I do fundamental research and invest long term in the best possible cryptocurrencies.
All right, fantastic. Well, thanks for joining today. This was great. And yeah, hope everyone has a good one.